In the shadowy stillness of a modest Victorian drawing room, the clock ticked on the mantelpiece with the sort of regularity that felt like a quiet, persistent sigh. The fire had long since died down to embers, and yet no one stirred to replenish it. That was just how things were. Cold, quiet, and ordered. The parlor, central hub of domestic life in a respectable household, was not, as one might hope, a place of laughter, flirtation, or romance. It was a place of posture, of waiting, of performing the appearance of virtue, while tucking away any unruly thought or inconvenient emotion into the inner drawer of one's soul. Just as the family silver was tucked away into the locked cabinet, behind lace curtains, for the unmarried woman of the mid to late 1800s. The parlor was her world and her cage. She might spend entire mornings practicing embroidery by the window, her movements delicate and deliberate, hoping the sun would cast a pleasant silhouette through the curtains and make her appear more marriageable. Not beautiful, not brilliant, not bold, just suitable. She wasn't alone. Somewhere in another house, a young man sat at a mahogany desk, writing letters he didn't quite mean, under the eye of a father who expected him to wed a girl with good breeding and good land. Not too loud, not too passionate, no blushes or wandering hearts, just respectable. In truth, the courtship process in Victorian England was never about love in the way we often imagine it. It was about alliances, appearances, stability. Not for nothing was the term suitable match uttered more often than love of my life. It began, often, not with hearts fluttering in moonlight, but with a recommendation. A mother might whisper over tea to her friend that her daughter was ready to receive callers. A cousin might mention at church that a certain young man had come into a decent inheritance. The web of social machinery began to hum softly into motion, not too fast, not too bold, lest it risk impropriety. Once introductions were made, a family might invite a young man to call, not alone, never alone, always with someone nearby, most often the mother or an aunt, perhaps an elderly chaperone who pretended to be asleep but missed nothing. And so the courtship began in the parlor, with its stiff-backed chairs, its ornamental clock, and the unspoken rules that hung heavy in the air like the scent of dried lavender. Every gesture mattered. Every silence had weight. To pour the tea too fast was a nervous mistake. To meet a young man's eyes too long scandalous. For many young women, there was a loneliness inside those parlors that was difficult to name. Their days were filled with small, domestic duties, selecting lace, organizing calling cards, practicing pianoforte. They might have sisters for company, or a governess nearby. But conversation often turned in circles. Like the skirts, they wore tightly bound at the waist, and never trailing too far. It was not the loneliness of abandonment, but the loneliness of always being observed. Even a walk in the garden had to be timed, supervised, and agreed upon. Letters were written under supervision. Feelings, if they ever grew at all, had to wait until they were safe. Marriage was not the beginning of love. It was the beginning of permission to show it. Men, too, were bound by these strange rituals. Though their world was larger, a bachelor in Victorian society was free to walk, to dine, to converse with other men over port and pipe smoke. But when it came to love or courtship, the rules crept in with equal weight. His family expected him to marry up or at least across, not for affection, for utility. There was a well-worn script to follow. He would call at the proper hour. He would present a card with his name in careful script. He would sit, never too close, and speak of the weather, or music, or literature. He would not speak of desire, or dreams, or doubts. If he smiled too much, it was vanity. If he smiled too little, it was coldness. Courtship was a performance, and the parlor was its stage. But unlike the theater, this stage had no audience to applaud. Only parents watching from the next room. Only younger siblings peeking through keyholes. Only society whispering behind fans at the next gathering. Sometimes a young couple would feel a flicker of something more, a shared glance, a private joke, a moment of breathless awareness in the space between teacups. But they dared not name it. Not yet. Not until the suitor wrote a formal letter of intention to the young woman's father. Not until the reply arrived with the proper approval. Not until the engagement was announced in the paper. Even then, love had to be gentle, contained. Timed engagements could last months, sometimes years, long enough to prove character. Long enough to ensure that neither party had any shameful secrets. Long enough for the families to agree on finances. And through it all, the parlor remained the same, dusting every morning. Curtains drawn at the same hour, teacups placed just so. For those outside the wealthier classes, the rituals were less elaborate, but no less restrictive. A working-class girl in a mill town might still require her parents' approval before walking with a young man. Courtship happened on Sundays, in borrowed best clothes, with neighbors watching. Even there, the hope was the same. A future, a house, a life, not passion, not poetry, just peace, or the semblance of it. The idea of falling in love with someone for who they were before all the permissions and procedures was not encouraged. It was even considered dangerous. Impetuous love stories, like those in serialized novels or forbidden French books, were whispered about with disapproval. Love, when it came, had to be orderly. It had to be quiet. It had to ask first. And yet, in the margins of all that formality, hearts still beat. Young women still dreamed at their embroidery hoops. Young men still imagined what it might be like to take a walk without being watched. Servants whispered gossip about who fancied whom. Postboys delivered letters with trembling hands. Flowers were pressed into pages, forgotten and remembered. Again, there were moments, brief, quiet moments, when love tried to make itself known. A brush of hands when passing the sugar. A piano duet played too slowly, just to prolong it. A flower left anonymously on a doorstep, but mostly, there was silence. Silence in the drawing rooms, silence in the letters unsent, silence in the hearts. Trained to behave, the Victorian era prized control, and in its pursuit of order, it made courtship something resembling a business transaction, wrapped in ribbons and etiquette books. It was not meant to be exciting. It was meant to be safe. But it was also, for many, deeply lonely. Behind every invitation to call, there was fear of scandal. Behind every folded glove, a suppressed emotion. Behind every polite smile, the aching wish to say more but not knowing how or if or when. That this was the beginning of love in Victorian England, in the parlor, with cold tea, with quiet clocks, with longing pressed into lace. And so we begin our journey through the strange and stifled world of Victorian romance, a world where dating did not sparkle or rush or bloom. It waited, it obeyed, it endured, it wore gloves, and it rarely said what it meant. The chaperone never slept, even when her eyes were closed, perhaps with a faint snore and a gloved hand resting. On her lap, she was not truly asleep. Her presence loomed like the ticking of a long case clock, unrelenting, predictable, and impossible. to ignore. In Victorian England, a young unmarried woman was never alone with a man. Not in a garden, not in a hallway, certainly not in a parlor. And so, when a young gentleman came calling, he would not find his beloved waiting with roses in her cheeks and a book of poetry in her lap. He would find her seated stiffly beside a chaperone, usually a mother, an aunt, or an older female companion who took her responsibility as the guardian of virtue extremely seriously. And so began the ritual of courtship, conducted not between two people, but among three. Tea would be served, usually too early or too late to still be warm. The young man would sip it politely, grimacing only slightly if it had gone bitter or cold. The young woman would pour herself a cup, but often not drink it, partly from nerves, partly because every movement of her wrist was being watched. The chaperone would take the most comfortable chair. The young suitor would take the most awkward one, usually a low footstool or the corner of a stiff-backed armchair that creaked. There would be a silence, not the gentle, companionable kind, but a taut, waiting silence. The kind of silence that needs to be filled with something proper. The young man might clear his throat and comment on the weather, quite mild for April. He might say, cautiously, indeed. The young woman would reply, eyes politely downcast, voice measured, and then the chaperone would speak, perhaps about the roses in the garden, or the new sermon the vicar gave last Sunday. Something neutral, something safe, something to prevent emotion from sneaking into the room. Even in this supposed moment of romantic connection, there was rarely a private word exchanged. If a young gentleman complimented the embroidery on the cushion, he was not speaking to the woman who made it, but to the chaperone, who would judge whether the comment was appropriate. If he asked about the piano music he heard from outside, it was not a question, but a signal, measured, cautious, and laden with the hope of an invitation to hear it played. Sometimes the young woman would be asked to play something. This was a double test of skill and of poise. She would rise with a curtsy, walk carefully to the piano, and place her gloved fingers on the keys. The selection would be tasteful, never too loud, never too romantic. Certainly not Chopin's nocturnes. Something gentler. A Mendelssohn piece, perhaps, or a hymn arranged for parlors. As she played, the chaperone would nod approvingly. The young man would sit with a straight back and offer a faint smile, not too much, lest he seem overly familiar, not too little, lest he appear disinterested. And when the piece ended, everyone would thank her with exactly the right level of enthusiasm. Courtship was performance, and chaperones were the critics. The role of the chaperone was not merely tradition, was obligation. A family's honor was believed to be embedded in the virtue of its daughters. A young woman left unattended with a man, even for a moment, could bring scandal upon the household. Rumors traveled faster than trains. A whispered suggestion of impropriety could mean a ruined reputation, a broken engagement, or worse, being marked as unmarriageable. So the chaperone remained, even on walks through the garden, even at family dinners, even on outings to the theatre, seated firmly between the courting pair like a wall of pressed lavender and disapproval. Chaperones weren't always hostile, of course. Some were kindly aunts, more interested in their knitting than in scolding. Some, even, were quiet, allies turning a blind eye to a stolen glance, or pretending not to notice a note slipped into a book. But more often than not, the chaperone stood as the reminder that affection was a dangerous thing, a risky thing, something to be supervised, scheduled, and softened until it no longer resembled real feeling at all. And so courtship became a series of interactions not with the beloved, but through them. A young man might ask the chaperone if her niece enjoyed reading. The chaperone might glance at the girl and answer, "She prefers moral fiction." The girl might blush, but say nothing. This was how relationships unfolded. In polite fictions and quiet endurance, it was not that feelings did not exist, but that their expression had to be subdued, disguised, and delayed. Passion was not forbidden outright, but its arrival before a formal engagement was considered dangerous, like opening a letter that wasn't addressed to you. There were rare moments when couples could speak privately, but they were rare indeed. A chaperone might step out of the room for a moment to collect more tea, but even this was often deliberate, a way of granting precisely 60 seconds of semi-privacy, during which the entire course of a relationship might hang in the balance. A whispered word, a slight touch of fingers as a cup was passed, a murmur of intention, then dash footsteps in the hall. Back to the script, back to the distance, back to the tea, now completely cold. For those in more rural areas or less affluent households, courtship could look slightly different, but the principles remained. The village might serve as its own chaperone. Neighbors watched, shopkeepers gossiped, mothers sent younger siblings to shadow couples on walks. There were even guidebooks for chaperones, pamphlets and articles that laid out precisely what was expected, how long a visit should last, what topics were permissible, whether the young man should be offered a second slice of cake, and what that might imply. Even the seating arrangement could be symbolic. If the chaperone sat between the couple, strict oversight. If she sat across the room, cautious optimism. And when the suitor left, the true courtship began not between the young man and the woman, but between him and her family. Did he rise quickly? Did he bow properly? Did he forget his gloves or fidget? All were noted, and then, perhaps, came the next step, an invitation to call again or silence. Courtship could end not with heartbreak, but with no reply, and a girl might sit for days, pretending not to look out the window, pretending not to wait. The chaperone, meanwhile, might knit silently in the corner, her needles clicking softly, an unofficial metronome for a song that might never begin. There's something profoundly lonely about speaking always through someone else, of having your affections rooted through layers of etiquette and authority, of sipping cold tea while your feelings brew hotter than anyone will allow you to show. But this was how Victorian romance unfolded in quiet rooms, with polite phrases, with a third party always listening. The presence of a chaperone was meant to preserve virtue, but it also preserved silence. It prevented scandal, but also suppressed sincerity. It created an architecture of safety that was also a labyrinth of longing. And yet, within those quiet constraints, small rebellions bloomed. A coded glance, a finger tapping out a rhythm on a porcelain cup, a pause before answering a question, long enough to suggest there was more behind the words. These were the love stories that unfolded not in letters or poetry, but in half sentences and shared silences. They weren't grand, they weren't passionate, but they were real. Their carefulness, real in their restraint, real in their persistence despite it all. Chaperones might have ruled the room, but huts quiet, stubborn things still managed to find their own way through. And so the parlor remained filled with its old rituals, with footsteps that paused at thresholds, with tea that was brewed too early, with conversations spoken in the conditional tense. Would you care for music? Should the weather hold, perhaps a stroll. and always, always a watchful eye in the room. Because, in Victorian England, the greatest threat to order wasn't scandal, it was unsupervised affection, and so the chaperone stayed, and the tea went cold, and two people sat a careful distance apart, waiting for permission to feel something real. There were so many things you couldn't say, and perhaps even more that you couldn't think. In Victorian England, love didn't begin with a confession. It began with a silence. A heavy, well-mannered silence, dressed in silk and seated with perfect posture. If you were a young woman, you might sit with your back straight, your fan folded neatly in your lap, your eyes trained just slightly to the left of the man speaking to you. Not on him, not quite. To look directly was forward. To look away entirely was rude. There was a correct angle, a correct softness of gaze. Even your eyelids had to be modest. And if you were a young man, you might nod at just the right moment, allowing a ghost of a smile, but never too wide, never too long. Flirtation had to be invisible to the untrained eye, or at least deniable, because to show too much was to reveal desire. And in the rigid world of Victorian courtship, desire was dangerous, especially in women who were supposed to be pure, passive, and largely unbothered by anything more urgent than embroidery or afternoon piano practice. So love was communicated, if at all, through things. A glance, a glove, a fan, even silence could be full of meaning, if you knew how to read it. One of the more absurdly intricate systems of courtship came through fan languager, real, though often satirized, code of communication developed for use in drawing rooms, balls, and theaters. To hold one's fan with the handle to the lips meant kiss me. To open it slowly meant wait for me. To drop it meant we will be friends. To twirl it in the left hand meant we are watched. And of course, to fan yourself slowly meant I am married, the most daring move. Drawing the fan across one's cheek, a signal that meant I love you. But these messages, however coded, were rarely used with sincerity. More often, they were whispered about in mockery or listed in women's magazines for amusement. Still, the very idea that a woman might express interest through the flutter of a fan was both thrilling and mildly scandalous. It was a safe rebellion, an allowable fantasy, like speaking in dreams. Then there were gloves, which also carried their own meanings. A dropped glove could signal interest, but only if not retrieved too quickly. Turning a glove inside out while removing it might mean I hate you, or, more gently, I am disappointed in you. Touching gloves together was as close as many couples ever came to holding hands in public. The softness of kid leather brushing against its match could carry more feeling than a dozen spoken declarations, and the removal of a glove, that was serious. A bare hand, visible in public, was a vulnerable thing. A woman without gloves was either family or scandalous. The etiquette books of the day were full of rules for how to move, how to sit, how to speak, how not to think. They were manuals for self-erasure, encouraging a young woman to vanish politely behind her manners, her dress, and her silence. One particularly popular guide advised a young lady should never permit a gentleman to touch even the hem of her dress before engagement. Another reminded readers, a woman who allows emotion to enter her speech may find her character soon doubted by society. Books like The Habits of Good Society or Hints on Etiquette and the Usages of Society became standard gifts for girls on the edge of womanhood. These were not just books, they were instruction manuals for acceptable invisibility, and the instructions were endless. How many steps behind a gentleman to walk? How long to leave a calling card? How to carry a parasol? How to refuse a dance? And how often before it became rude? Even when to laugh? And how much was too much? An open laugh was considered coarse. A giggle might be permissible, if disguised behind a gloved hand. Too much pleasure in conversation. Improper, too little. Cold. It was a tightrope stretched across a drawing-room floor, and everyone was expected to walk it in a corset and heels. For men, the rules were different, but no less stifling. He must not appear desperate. He must not be too charming. He must not speak of anything below a lady's sphere nor shop talk. No politics, no scandal. And while it was understood that he might have more worldly experience, he must never speak of it. Not even hint. A single misplaced word could cause a father to bar the door. A too eager compliment could make a girl's mother tighten her grip on the family's social standing. Entire courtships ended on a sigh. The wrong intonation, the wrong gift, the wrong book recommended. All were risks, and so men too learned to speak in delicate, deniable gestures. A pause before opening the door. A hand held just a little too long as she stepped from a carriage. The question, "Shall I call again?" Miss asked with all the weight of a marriage proposal. There were also advice columns, especially aimed at women. These were strange hybrids of instruction and entertainment, half moral warning, half whispered curiosity. A typical letter might read, "Dear Madame Restal, I am a girl of 19, recently introduced to society. A gentleman of 27 has expressed interest in my conversation on geology. I am confused as to whether this implies affection. I fear to overstep. Should I respond with enthusiasm or reserve? Anxious in Bayswater." The answer would come back, always careful. "My dear Miss Bayswater, affection must never be assumed. A lady must remain cautious, as warmth may be mistaken for impropriety. Respond with politeness, but coolness, and do not encourage further interest without parental approval." In this way, even curiosity was folded neatly back into restraint. Flirtation was a riddle wrapped in etiquette. A young woman might spend months trying to determine if a certain suitor truly favored her or if he was simply being polite. She would analyze his every word, every pause, every moment of hesitation. Her diary might be full of sentences like, "He stood too long by the window. Did he wish to speak to me alone? His hand brushed mine when passing the teacup. Could it mean affection? He said he enjoyed the sound of my playing. Mother said he meant it kindly. I dare not hope." And yet, for all the rules, all the restrictions, people still fell in love, slowly, cautiously, in my stolen looks and restrained words and gestures, as soft as the brush of lace on a sleeve. They made do with what was allowed, or they suffered quietly, when even that was denied. The repression of feeling didn't end with courtship. It continued into marriage. Many women went into their wedding nights having no idea what to expect, having been told only that a good wife must be obedient, modest, and silent. Passion was not discussed. Desire was not acknowledged. The human body itself was cloaked in euphemism, and still they loved. They found ways to speak, to feel, to connect within the limits, or sometimes just barely outside them. But before all of that, before the wedding, before the letter of intention, before the fragile engagement rings tied with blue ribbons, there was the courtship, and before the courtship, there was the silence, the things you could not say, the feelings you could not say, the feelings you could not hold, the the thoughts you could not hold, the thoughts you had to tuck into your sleeve like a secret note. All of it contained, all of it restrained, all of it woven into the very fabric of Victorian romance, not as an exception, but as its foundation to love. You had to become a ghost, and to flirt, you had to do so invisibly, but hearts still beat, even beneath corsets, even behind lace, even in silence. The parlor clock ticked with the gentle persistence of a life lived on schedule. In a quiet townhouse on a cobbled London street, the fire crackled politely, never wildly, and the scent of coal smoke mingled with lavender sachets tucked into armchairs. Everything had its time, and so did love, or at least something dressed up to resemble it. In Victorian England, romantic spontaneity was considered, at best, vulgar, and at worst, dangerous. To entertain ideas of passion, of sudden declarations, or poetic proposals, was to court disorder. What the era valued instead was structure, precision, respectability. In the world of courtship, feelings were scheduled, affection was supervised, and emotional progression was carefully charted like a business transaction between families with much to lose. At the center of this deeply managed world was the courtship calendar, a quiet, meticulous arrangement of days and hours in which young people could perform the semblance of affection under the unblinking eye of society. At-home days, the only door that opened for women of the middle and upper classes. Every week had its own rhythm, one that rarely bent toward leisure or flirtation. But if there was a socially acceptable moment for such things to occur, it was the at-home day. Every respectable family designated one afternoon per week, during which the lady of the house would receive callers. This was not, however, an invitation in the modern sense. Rather, it was an obligation of visibility, formal display of hospitality, manners, and quiet power. On these days, the drawing room was polished to perfection. Tea was set precisely at the right temperature, lukewarm, enough to sip slowly without rushing a conversation, but not hot enough to burn the tongue or stir discomfort. The unmarried daughters, properly attired and postured, would be present, ready to entertain visitors approved in advance by the father or mother. These visits, never spontaneous, were listed in a small bound book, a social calendar kept near the hall stand or on the lady's writing desk. If a gentleman caller appeared without previous arrangement, he would most likely be turned away by the butler. "Miss Eleanor is not at home," he would be told, even if Miss Eleanor was sitting in the very next room, practicing the pianoforte, because at home was not a fact, it was a coded message. It meant, you are welcome or you are not. The calendar of courtship. A week in rituals. Imagine a courtship calendar pinned neatly inside a modest Victorian diary. Monday might be reserved for family obligations, visiting elderly relatives, or tending to correspondence. Tuesday, perhaps, was the at-home day. Wednesday could bring a church gathering or a musical evening. Thursday might be blank, but only publicly reserved privately for recuperation or planning. Fridays and Saturdays were often the most anticipated. Public events such as garden parties or charity functions afford rare opportunities for young men and women to be seen together, albeit always in the company of others. Sunday was sacred, of course. Church, followed by a family luncheon, and perhaps a walk in the garden, if the weather allowed and the chaperone was in a generous mood. And through it all, every minute was accounted for. A visit should last no more than 30 minutes. A letter must be answered within 48 hours. A flower offered in courtship should be chosen with care, not to forward, not to sentimental. Red roses were bold, violets were appropriate, daisies, perhaps too childish love, or whatever passed for it in those rigid drawing rooms, was a matter of calculation. Appointments instead of affections. Romance was never supposed to be easy or even pleasant. The young man might have consulted his own social diary before attempting to request time with a potential bride. He would write a letter never too long asking permission to call. If the reply was favorable, he would be permitted to visit at a certain time on a certain day, under the watchful presence of her mother or a designated companion. He would arrive, hat in hand, boots polished, necktie tight. She would receive him with downcast eyes, a modest smile, and hands folded just so. A few pleasantries might pass: the weather, her piano practice, the progress of her embroidery. The conversation would tread carefully, like dancers trying to avoid squeaky floorboards, and then it would end precisely when expected. He would rise, bow, thank her for the privilege of her time, and take his leave. She would return to her needlework, her sister, or the family pet. The visit might be noted in the calendar, or it might be dismissed with silence. What mattered was not what was said, but that the visit had occurred, and that it had followed all the proper rules. The presence of the family and the absence of privacy. It's easy now, in hindsight, to view Victorian courtship as a kind of emotional starvation. But for many, at the time, this rigid, choreographed process offered a sense of stability in a world where scandal could ruin not just a reputation, but an entire lineage. Family involvement was essential. A courtship was not simply the concern of the couple, it was a contract between houses. Parents evaluated each potential match with all the scrutiny of bankers reviewing a loan application. Was the young man employed? Did he have land? A future? Were there rumors in society about his sister or uncle or father? Had he once danced too freely at a ball? Had he ever praised the novels of Mary Wollstonecraft? Even a whisper of impropriety could lead to crossed-out entries in the calendar and the sudden, unexplained absence of invitations. The timetable of disappointment, of course. Not every entry in the calendar led to marriage. Most did not. Many visits led nowhere. A young man might appear for 3 Tuesdays in a row, only to vanish without explanation. A girl's name might be mentioned during supper, only to disappear from the conversation the following week. Sometimes hearts grew hopeful in secret, to be quietly bruised by the next cold letter or the empty space in the drawing room schedule. But to express disappointment was discouraged. One must not complain. One must not sigh. One must simply write another letter, press another lace collar, and prepare for another Thursday, courting without ever touching throughout it all. Physical contact was virtually non-existent. A gloved hand offered for assistance from a carriage was perhaps the closest brush of flesh a courting couple might share during the early weeks or even months of their acquaintance. A walk in the park, always with a chaperone trailing at a respectful distance, might allow for a moment of mutual silence in the rustling of leaves. In this world, love had no room to breathe. It was boxed, labeled, scheduled, and often stifled before it could blossom. There were no whispered I love yous, no impulsive embraces, no shared glances across candlelit tables. There were just appointments, pages filled with names and times and rules, and still a glimmer, and yet, despite it all, a few found ways to connect. A compliment slipped between discussions of weather, a favorite book mentioned, then referenced again the following week, a piano piece repeated just for him, a letter folded with the corner turned just so. Small rebellions, quietly staged, Because, even in the most buttoned-up of calendars, the human heart sometimes wandered off schedule, in the silence of a parlor where no secrets could be spoken aloud, where a lady's glance might be her only rebellion. One thing remained untouched by chaperones' dash letters. Letters were the slow, deliberate heartbeat of Victorian romance. Unfolded in secret, behind closed doors and beneath ticking clocks, their ink holding more emotion than could ever be spoken in a drawing room. But even here, in this quiet paper world, the rules remained. There was no escape. Love had to wear gloves even in handwriting. It all began with stationery. Not just any scrap of paper would do. Respectable families maintained specific writing paper, monogrammed or bordered delicately in pale shades. Ivory was considered modest. Pale blue was for friendships. Pink was scandalous. Black bordered paper signified mourning and was not to be used for affairs of the heart unless one was grieving and courting simultaneously, a rare but documented phenomenon. The wrong choice could cause a stir. Too decorative, too casual, too plain. Every shade whispered meanings. Then came the pen. A lady's handwriting was judged as much as her character. A slant to bold might suggest unladylike confidence. A messy curl on a letter G might hint at uncontrolled emotion. And worst of all, blotted ink and unsteady hand, a trembling confession, something careless. So letters were often drafted first, then rewritten slowly and precisely. Entire evenings passed this way, in the glow of gaslight, a girl hunched in a backed chair, redrafting a line. I hope your aunt's recovery continues apace. Instead of I missed you in church, the content itself was a delicate matter. The tone had to be restrained, yet warm. Letters were not to be too emotional, not too eager, certainly never forward. A phrase such as, I await your next call with anticipation, might already raise a parental eyebrow. The real message often lived between the lines, in the choice of words, the spacing, and the gentle undercurrent of suggestion. But writing was only half the challenge. Delivering the letter was another matter entirely. In well-off homes, the post arrived more than once a day. This convenience, however, also increased the chance of interception. Parents often opened their children's letters before handing them over. Servants might gossip, and siblings might pry. Letters between lovers especially those not yet officially engaged, had to be hidden with skill and vigilance. Some young women kept special desks or writing boxes with secret compartments. Beneath the false bottoms of drawers were of ribbons, pressed flowers, and letters folded in halves and quarters, worn soft from being read over and over. Some locked them, others tied them with lace garters, or buried them beneath knitting or prayer books. It wasn't unusual for a mother to discover a note and hold it hostage until it could be properly investigated. If letters were deemed improper to frequent, too warm, too poetic, they could be used as evidence to terminate a courtship. A father might summon a suitor for a stern talk, holding the letter out like an arrest warrant. A mother might tear it in two without reading it aloud. If the writer had used a non-standard abbreviation, quoted poetry too suggestively, or signed, "Off with yours ever," trouble might follow. Delays, too, were common and tragic. A letter sent with good intentions could arrive late due to rain, a distracted maid, or a missing stamp. Sometimes they vanished altogether. A young man might wait weeks for a reply that never came, not knowing it had been confiscated and burned. A girl might assume a suitor had forgotten her, only to find out months later that her reply had been stolen by a jealous cousin. Heartbreak in the Victorian age was often quiet and There were no shouted arguments, no dramatic reunions at train stations. Instead, there was silence, an unanswered letter, a broken wax seal left unread, a final note, short and cold. It has been decided that our correspondence must cease. Of course, some use the system to their advantage. A clever young woman might leave a letter in a book she lent. A sympathetic servant might act as a courier. In rare and romantic cases, a well-trained dog or a loyal carriage driver carried secrets between estates. But these strategies were risky. The cost of discovery was immense. One notable story survives from a diary found in a country vicarage. A girl, Lucy, had fallen in love with a curate staying in the area. Forbidden from writing to him directly, she hid her letters beneath the cushion of a pew they both frequented. For months, they wrote in this quiet, coded way, their hearts unfolding between sermons. But when a new cleaning lady was hired, the secret was lost. The letters were found and brought to the vicar's wife. Lucy was forbidden from attending services for 3 months. The curate was relocated. The pew sat empty. Even among married couples, letter writing retained a strange formality. A husband travelling to London might write a polite note to his wife back home in Bath. "I trust the gardener has addressed the drainage. My regards to your sister, yours in devotion." Rarely would he say, "I miss you." Even rarer, "I love you." Such words were reserved for wedding vows and deathbeds. But not all letters were soft and melancholic. Some were sharp, brutal. The famed Dear John letters breakup notes were already a tradition. Some women wrote preemptive rejections too. Men who hadn't yet proposed but were showing signs of interest. "I regard you with sisterly affection," one might write, which meant, "Do not ask me anything further." Others received rejections after months of careful interaction. The letter phrased so delicately, it was hard to tell whether one had been turned down or simply placed on hold indefinitely. There were even guides for this. The Etiquette of Courtship and Matrimony, published in 1852, offered templates. For men, "Dear Miss _, I am sensible of the honor your acquaintance has brought. Yet I must respectfully inform you that I am, at present, unfit for the holy estate of matrimony. For women, dear sir, I esteem your regard, but feel compelled by circumstances to decline your kind offer." Imagine being 17, trembling with hope, and receiving one of these. Still, some letters endured. They were folded and refolded until the creases wore through. They were hidden in lockets, sewn into hems, kept beneath pillows. Women, especially, preserved them like relics. In later life, some widows kept boxes of these letters tied in silk ribbons, each one a fossil of a feeling never fully shared aloud. Sometimes, in old age, they read them aloud to themselves. Slowly, softly, one line at a time. A letter that had once made them blush, now made them weep. But even then, the words remained restrained. The ache lived in what wasn't said. Just as in life, so. In letters, silence said everything. There were no dating apps in Victorian England. No candlelit dinners. No moonlit strolls that ended in spontaneous kisses. No asking someone out over coffee. Instead, there were ledgers, family names, land holdings, aunts who judged your posture, and mothers, oh, the mothers whose matchmaking schemes could have rivaled military strategies. Let us return to the drawing room, soft with ticking clocks and overstuffed chairs, where daughters sat in white muslin, sipping tea with perfect posture. The lace curtains barely stirred in the draught, but inside, the pressure was suffocating. Because marriage, you see, was not just about love. It was about survival, status, and above all money. The business of matrimony to the modern mind, romance, often suggests passion, affection, a spark of the unexpected. But to the Victorians, especially the upper and middle classes, marriage was a contract, a binding arrangement, often negotiated with as much cool calculation as the purchase of a property or the hiring of a governess. Love might come later if one were lucky, but first came dowries. A dowry, in its simplest form, was the financial offering a bride's family brought to the union. It might be money, land, furniture, or bonds. The dowry wasn't just tradition, it was leverage. A girl's future on the marriage market depended heavily on how much her parents were willing to give away with her. For many families with several daughters and limited means, this created an unspoken hierarchy. The eldest often received the largest dowry. After all, she must marry well to pave the way for the others. But as the money dwindled, so did the prospects of younger sisters. In such homes, the phrase "left on the shelf" took on a quiet, painful weight. A matchmaker's dance. While formal matchmakers were less common in England than in other parts of the world, their work was still done just under other names. There was always a mother or an aunt who took charge. She would quietly inquire after a gentleman's income, the standing of his family, whether he had prospects in Parliament, or perhaps a sizable estate in Shropshire. Some women kept little books for these things: names, dates, inheritance, rumours, eligible. Men were catalogued like horses at auction. He has a limp, but comes with £4,000 a year. He's penniless, but charming, a poor investment. He's ugly, but owns half of Devon. The daughters, for their part, were trained to smile, to know when to laugh and when to fall silent, to never seem eager, to never seem bored, to keep their accomplishments in a delicate balance, accomplished enough to impress, but not so bold as to frighten. Balls, bazaars, and the economics of visibility public appearances mattered. Balls were less about dancing and more about being. Seen to be invited to the right events meant your family had standing. To be seen dancing with the right men meant your name was circulating in the right mouths. Even church attendants were strategically must be seen kneeling in the same pews as a suitable bachelor and his widowed mother. Daughters were paraded in seasonal rotations. The London season, capitalized of course, was a time when families descended upon the city in droves, dresses packed, carriages polished, social calendars full. Young ladies were presented at court, sometimes literally, and the courting dance began in earnest. For those outside the elite, village dances, bazaars and garden parties offered smaller stages, but the stakes were just as high. One misstep, a laugh too loud, a handshake too long, and whispers began. The matriarchs behind the curtains. Now let us pause and take a breath in the back parlor, where a mother sharpens a letter opener and a daughter's hands tremble ever so slightly. Behind every eligible young woman was a matriarch watching, waiting, maneuvering. Some mothers lived through their daughters. Others feared for their own reputations if a child remained unmarried past her prime. Some were quietly loving. Others were relentless. There were stories whispered late at night of girls forced into matches they begged to escape, of engagements broken off when a better offer appeared, of suitors warned away by a mother who had already made other plans. And the pressure was subtle, too. A daily drip, a sigh at breakfast. Mrs. Hamilton's daughter is engaged already, you know. A cold stare at church when a gentleman passed without tipping his hat. A new dress bought not for joy, but for strategy. The price of refusal would happen when a woman said no. The consequences could be social, financial, even existential in many circles. Declining a proposal, especially a good one, meant stepping further towards spinsterhood. If the rejected suitor had status, your family might suffer socially. Gossip was merciless. Women were not always believed to know what was best for themselves. And if a girl dared fall in love with the wrong sort, a man with no income, a tutor, a mere clerk, that path led to scandal or silence. Some did elope, some were disinherited, others simply pined until the world forgot them. Spinsterhood, the shelf of shadows to be left on the shelf, was to live under a quiet cloud. It meant being too old past 25, in some cases, and therefore no longer desirable on the marriage market. Spinsterhood wasn't always miserable. Some women carved out quiet, fulfilling lives. They painted, they taught, they read in gardens and raised nieces. But society made sure they knew they had failed. There were even manuals for them, advice columns, sermons, consoling phrases about God's plan and making peace with one's station. And always, behind it all, the weight of not having fulfilled your duty, not having made the match, marriage, markets, and moral panics sometimes. The language used to describe courtship was telling. Young women were spoken of as good catches. Matches were secured. Gentlemen were landed or reeled in. It was a market with all the artificial polish of a storefront window, and like any market, it was subject to panics. Moral panics. In this case, articles abounded warning of young women becoming too bold, daring to write to men first, daring to speak their minds. Etiquette manuals were printed in alarming numbers, with long chapters devoted to the dangers of independence. One book warned that reading novels could inflame the female imagination. Another advised women to never mention money, illness, or politics in front of a suitor. Instead, speak of embroidery, speak of the weather, and smile always. Smile between heart and household. Of course, there were exceptions. Love did bloom. There were stolen glances across ballrooms, letters slipped into books, hands brushed under the teacups. There were marriages of affection, even passion, but they happened within tight, suffocating walls, and always under the gaze of someone watching. If you were lucky, your love matched your family's ambition. If you were very lucky, it survived the process of matchmaking at all. For most, though, Victorian courtship was not a romance. It was a role, a duty, a contract, drafted by parents and signed in silence. Now the drawing room is still. The fire has gone to embers. The lace curtains shift ever so slightly in the draught, and somewhere, in a locked desk drawer, rests a letter never sent, folded in thirds, sealed with wax. The name on the front never spoken aloud, but the heart, even in Victorian England, had its own quiet ways of beating. Sleep now, traveller. Let the lace fall soft, and the whispers of the past grow quiet again. There was a time not very long ago when an entire conversation could take place between two people without a single word being spoken. A glance down, the flick of a wrist, a deliberate drop of a lace-edged glove onto the floor-rich gesture, was a phrase, each accessory a syllable in a language of longing. This was the Victorian courtship ritual, draped not in roses or poetry, but in fan signals, glove etiquette, and the subtle choreography of parasols. In a world where open flirtation was taboo and feelings were suspect unless sanctioned by propriety, young men and women became quiet performers in a dance of symbols, where everything meant something, and everything was a risk. The glove that fell on purpose, Imagine a drawing room in the spring of 1874. The curtains are drawn back to let in polite sunlight, filtered through lace and dust. A young woman, Miss Edith Merivale, enters with her mother and sits precisely where she is expected to. Her gown rustles, not flamboyantly, but audibly enough to mark her presence. A gentleman caller, Mr. Henry Atwater, arrives not long after. His boots are polished. His collar is stiff with starch. He is not allowed to sit beside her, nor behind her. He may speak to her through the room through her mother, or aunt, or the woman who poured tea. Yet, in one quiet motion, Edith leans down and accidentally lets a single glove slip from her wrist and fall to the floor between them. She does not retrieve it. Instead, she waits, breath held, posture perfect as Henry crosses the room to pick it up. He does so slowly, deliberately, and when he returns it to her, she dares to meet his eyes. Just for a second, not a word is spoken. But to a Victorian observer, this was a shout. To drop your glove was to declare interest. To allow a gentleman to retrieve it, especially without correction, was a way of saying, I see you, and I do not disapprove. The fan that whispered yes or no, and then there were the fans, delicate, hand-painted, sometimes imported from France or carved from ivory. Fans were more than decoration, they were tools of communication. Young women were taught, often from girlhood, how to use their fan to signal messages during dances or social gatherings. If a lady slowly fanned herself, it meant she was already taken. A fast fluttering fan might mean she was flustered. If she touched her closed fan to her right cheek, it meant yes, left cheek, no. If she twirled it in her right hand, she was watching someone. If she drew it slowly across her eyes, she wished to be rid of a suitor. And if she closed it with a snap, was a signal of displeasure, perhaps even insult. There were guides to this silent language, printed not in scandal sheets, but in etiquette manuals. Some were sold discreetly in shops near Bond Street or tucked into the back of women's magazines. Mothers whispered their meanings into daughters' ears, passing down the fan language the way other families passed down heirloom recipes or family silver dot at a crowded ball. With music playing and dozens of eyes watching, it was the only way to speak the truth. The handkerchief Codovan, the humble handkerchief embroidered, lace-trimmed, perfumed, was an instrument of suggestion. To drop a handkerchief in the presence of a gentleman might appear to be a clumsy accident, but it wasn't always. If she dropped it near him and did not retrieve it, she gave him permission to approach. If he picked it up and pressed it gently before returning it, he acknowledged her signal and returned her interest. Of course, there were risks. If a handkerchief was dropped but ignored, it stung. And if a chaperone retrieved it instead, the moment was ruined. Everything had to be timed just so, like threading a needle in a storm. A parasol that spoke in spirals. Ladies' parasols were another unlikely language device. These weren't the wide-brimmed umbrellas of modern memory, but small, decorative pieces, freely, fragile, and utterly essential. They shaded skin from the sun, of course, but they also served as subtle signaling tools. If a woman held her parasol over her right shoulder, she was saying, "Follow me." If she swung it slowly with both hands, it meant she was engaged or otherwise unavailable. And if she rested it on her left shoulder, it was an invitation to approach. There were even more obscure meanings, like gently tapping it on the toe, which could indicate nervousness or a wish to be rescued from a boring conversation. To spin it slowly while walking could mean flirtation, or, depending on the region, it might just mean she was daydreaming. The problem with symbolic language is that its dialects varied. What meant "I like you" in Surrey might mean "stay away" in Devon. Courtship was as much about decoding as it was about desire. A pocketful of gloves, gloves themselves, beyond being a signal when dropped, carried a whole system of meaning. When given or worn, to remove one's glove and offer a bare hand was scandalously intimate. The gloved hand was a formality, a mask, a distance. But a bare hand, that was flesh, that was warmth. To hold a bare hand, even for a moment, during a dance, could be the most electric moment of an entire year. If a man sent a glove to a woman as a gift, it meant he admired her and wished her to think of him. If she returned it, unworn, it was a polite refusal. But if she wore it to a ball, worse, was seen fidgeting with it during a song he'd requested, it meant she remembered him. Sometimes a glove would be scented with lavender or pressed with a tiny flower between the fingers. Sometimes men would sleep with a woman's glove beneath their pillow, dreaming foolish dreams of imagined futures that might never come to pass. Whispers in codes and crinolinal of this the fans. The gloves, the parasols and dropped lace might seem theatrical to modern eyes. But for Victorians, it was the only acceptable form of honesty. They lived in a world where letters were censored, where mothers lingered near doorways, and where to speak freely of love before a proposal was taboo. The only way to communicate interest, attraction, hope or heartache was through small, decipherable acts that could be denied if necessary. A twisted glove could be dismissed as nervousness. A spinning parasol could be explained away as habit. But those who understood, the love that couldn't be said aloud. One story survives from the diary of a young governess named Clara, who once wrote about watching her employer's daughter fall in love with a man she could never marry. They danced only once, Clara noted, and yet for the rest of the evening she toyed with the glove he had helped her retrieve. She folded and unfolded it, held it to her lips, dropped it again near the pianoforte, though she did not need to. She watched the door until it closed behind him, and then she said nothing for weeks. No letters were exchanged, no promises made, but that glove, worn thin from handling, remained in the girl's drawer for years, outlasting to arranged engagements and a lonely marriage. It was, perhaps, the truest romance of her life. Sleepy reflections in the language of Lyso now. As you drift towards sleep, imagine that old world eggingware. Every accessory was a message, and every message was a risk, where hearts beat beneath corsets and topcoats, and where people fell in love without touching, without speaking, with the way they held a fan, or dropped a glove, or dared to glance across a crowded room. It was a language of lace, a grammar of glances, and a dictionary of decorum. It was a time when love had to be clever, because to be bold was to be ruined. In the silence between each signal, there was always the hope that someone understood, even if they never said so. There is a certain hush that settles over a garden just before dusk. The low hum of insects, the rustling of holly leaves in the breeze, the faint chime of a bell from the drawing-room. All of these sounds formed the backdrop to hundreds of quiet, forbidden stories in Victorian England. For every parlor conversation watched over by a stern aunt with a monocle and a furrowed brow, there existed, just beyond the boxwood hedge, a trembling moment of rebellion. Not the loud, dramatic rebellion of novels, but the kind that involved inching a little closer on a garden bench, exchanging a pressed flower instead of a love letter, or slipping a note behind a loose brick in the sundial pedestal by Victorian. Courtship was meant to be measured, respectable, and above all, seen. But when love began to grow in the silence between monitored visits and stifled words, young hearts found a way to escape if only for a moment. The garden maze was often more than ornamental. In larger estates, these winding hedges were a way to display wealth and control over nature. Yet for many courting couples, they represented the one place where time might stretch, if only a little, and surveillance might shrink. A governess might walk a few steps behind, or a sister might pretend to admire the chrysanthemums while looking the other way. It didn't take long for the clever to discover that the third turn left in the maze ended at a clearing with a stone bench and no direct line of sight from the windows of the house. Here, a young gentleman might reach into his coat pocket, not for something scandalous, but for a volume of poetry by Tennyson or Rossetti. Within it, delicately folded, a letter, not addressed, not signed, but read and remembered nonetheless. Moonlight meetings and whispered risks by candlelight in their rooms. Many young women of good breeding lay not dreaming of ballrooms, but of that shadowed moment in the garden when a gentleman touched the sleeve of her glove. It was improper to speak of love, but a pressed finger to a gloved hand, a shared glance held just a second to long, these were tiny revolutions. When the house was asleep, save for the soft snores of uncles and the whisper of maids, tidying hearths and braver souls dared more. One girl, Margaret, the daughter of a strict military officer, once told her maid to keep the lamp low and her voice quieter than the wind. She crept barefoot across the hallway and out the side door, where William waited behind the lilac bushes with a lantern wrapped in a dark scarf. Their walk was no more than 15 minutes long. They didn't touch, they barely spoke, but they watched the moonlight dance on the fountain and made silent promises to remember the scent of honeysuckle and the exact sound of each other's footsteps in the gravel. The next day, Margaret's mother noted how pale she looked. "Perhaps less reading in the evening," she said. "It clouds the eyes." Margaret only nodded, hiding the smile that threatened to bloom. Books with hidden pagism, the many strategies used by love-struck Victorians. Perhaps the most ingenious was the use of books not as reading material, but as secret post. A book left on a garden bench with a dog-eared page might mark a prearranged message. A particular poem, marked in pencil, might carry a hidden meaning only two hearts could decode. In one known instance from a Surrey estate, a young tutor named Charles developed a subtle language with the daughter of his employer, Eleanor. They read from the same small library of classics. Eleanor would mark her copy of Pride and Prejudice with light charcoal dots beneath specific lines, such as, "Do anything rather than marry without affection." Charles, in turn, returned his copy of Jane Eyre to the shelf, annotated lightly with, "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will." To the untrained eye, the books were untouched, but between them, these passages whispered through the shelves, until Eleanor's mother decided Charles was perhaps too fond of fiction, and dismissed him before the summer ended. The language of plants, florography, the language of flowers, was another coded realm of Victorian courtship. In an era where speaking love aloud could lead to disgrace, a bouquet could say what lips could not. A sprig of lavender for devotion, a daisy for innocent affection, a red tulip for declaration of love. Hidden meanings bloomed in drawing rooms and parlor vases, and sometimes in the secret corners of gardens where no one watched too closely. In one Yorkshire household, a gardener found a small wrapped posy tucked behind the sundial base. It contained bluebell constancy, fern sincerity, forget, dash me, dash not true love, one single white rose, purity, the gardener. Respectful of young hearts, placed the bouquet back and mentioned it to no one. He did, however, tell his own granddaughter the story years later, with a glint in his eye. The risk of being seen every secret garden meeting came with risk. There were stories of housemaids fired for glancing too long at the son of the family, of cousins forbidden from seeing each other after one was caught passing a note beneath a dinner napkin, of girls sent away to stay with distant relatives after being spotted, laughing too loudly with the wrong sort of man by the greenhouse. In one London household, a daughter was nearly disowned after being seen walking unchaperoned along a path near Hyde Park. She claimed the man she walked with was her cousin from Bath. He was not. He was a clerk at her father's bank, and she had met him only twice before. The scandal was swift. Her reputation, once called promising, was marked fragile. She was married off the next year to a widower 20 years her senior. The man from the park never saw her again. Love in a time of Loxford, all the constraints placed on Victorian lovers. Love found its way through garden hedges, hidden corners of libraries, or the spaces between properly folded napkins at dinner. The most powerful stories are not the loudest ones. They are the ones told in gestures, in silences, and in fleeting shared experiences. A girl adjusting her bonnet slowly so that her fingers grazed his hand. A boy bringing a second cup of tea to a picnic, though only one was asked for. A pressed violet hidden in a coat pocket and returned 2 weeks later with a note folded small enough to fit inside a watch case. The endurance of gentle defiance. These stories were rarely written down. They weren't grand enough for novels or dramatic, enough for poetry, but they existed, soft, persistent, and terribly human. Behind every frown of a chaperone and every closed shutter at dusk was a quiet knowing that young people were always trying to slip past the rules, just a little. Not to destroy them, just to breathe a little more. Victorian gardens were not places of wild rebellion, but of gentle, careful defiance, where love, however cautious, bloomed between the hedges, where the maze wasn't just a design in the grass, but a metaphor for the lengths. One might wander to touch the hand of someone they could not name aloud, even in an age of locked drawers, stiff collars, and endless propriety. Hearts found a way to whisper to one another. And sometimes, if the wind was right, those whispers sounded a little like freedom. The parlor where love lingered was not the same for all. In Victorian England, the rules of courtship were not merely written by age or gender. They were etched, sometimes cruelly, into the social fabric of class. For the daughters of dukes and the sons of lords, love followed a path carpeted in etiquette, wealth, and legacy. But for the daughters of seamstresses and the boys who delivered coal, love was a quieter thing, softer, hidden, and often denied. The dignity of being called courtship at all. Let us begin quietly with the working class, the quiet dance of the working poor for the average girl in a working class family. The idea of being courted was not surrounded by lace and liveried footmen. It might begin on the steps of the factory after a long shift, when a boy from another floor offered to walk her home. Maybe he carried her lunch tin. Maybe he didn't speak at all, just walked beside her, their boots clapping in rhythm over cobblestones slick with soot. They did not have at-home days or drawing rooms. Their courting spaces were the alley behind the bakery, or the pews at chapel, or the benches in smoky public parks where they might sit in silence, watching geese splash in filthy ponds, Their hands might brush, they might share an apple. That was all. Still, even this was not free. Even the poor had rules. A girl who allowed a boy to sit too close, to walk her home too often, might find herself talked about by neighbors' women hanging washing between narrow brick tenements, tongues moving faster than the wind. A boy who loitered too long by a girl's door might be warned off by a protective father or brother. The family could not afford scandal, not because of pride, but because of need. A girl with a ruined reputation was less likely to find a husband. And for a girl whose life was labor and limited options, marriage, though rarely romantic, might still be her best hope of food, shelter, and the possibility of rest. The upper-class courtship theater. Now let us step into a different world. Let us climb the marble steps and push open the polished oak door of a grand house in Belgravia or Mayfair. Here lives a daughter of fortune, corseted and curated since birth. Not to find love, but to make an advantageous match. Courtship for her was spectacle. It was strategy. It was a series of carefully arranged calls and dances and carriage rides, all under supervision, all with the weight of inheritance pressing down on her embroidered sleeves. Her father, perhaps a viscount, might have business interests in India or the West Indies. Her mother might host grand garden parties where the guest list was plotted with a quill pen and a calculating heart. Into this world would be invited eligible bachelors, not always handsome, not always kind, but titled, or wealthy, or both. The young woman's role was not to choose, but to attract. She learned to smile without showing teeth, to speak without opinion, to dance without tiring, and to be interesting without ever being improper. She was told, often by her mother, that love would come later, or not at all, that it didn't matter. And yet, sometimes, in quiet moments, behind fans and folded music programs, even she might dream, might long for someone who looked at her not for her dowry, but for her eyes. But longing was dangerous. She had seen what happened to the daughters of baronets, who ran off with poor tutors or charming actors. Their names were not spoken at tea. Their portraits were taken down from the staircases. Respectable society was cruel, and its cruelty wore gloves. The impossible love between classes, occasionally a shopgirl might catch the gaze of a gentleman. A flower seller on the corner might be offered a coin with a smile too warm to be mere charity. The daughter of a blacksmith might hear, in church, the voice of a nobleman's younger son singing in the pew behind her, and sometimes foolish hearts would bloom in the narrow space between those glances. But such romances were not stories. They were scandals waiting to happen. For the gentleman, there was the danger of disgrace. For the girl, there was far more: ruin, unemployment, social death. She could lose everything for a kiss. Still, some tried. A well-documented case from the 1870s tells of a nobleman's son who fell in love with a governess. They met in secret for over a year. They exchanged letters through a footman. They planned to elope, but the letters were found. The girl was dismissed without reference. The boy was sent abroad. They never saw each other again. Their story lived on only in a faded box of ribbon-bound letters, discovered years later in the attic of the estate. The handwriting elegant, the ink smudged, the words full of aching restraint: class in the smallest gestures, class in Victorian. Courtship was not only in the houses or incomes, it was in the gestures. A working-class man removed his cap, an upper-class man tipped his hat. A poor girl might curtsy out of habit. A rich girl would incline her head just slightly less of a bow, more of a calculation. They used the same words. "Good afternoon, shall I walk you home? I hope your mother is well." But the meaning changed with the speaker's status. Politeness could be armor, or invitation, or both. Even shared spaces, parks, train carriages, church pews held invisible lines. A girl who crossed them with her eyes might be whispered about. A boy who crossed them with his boots might be arrested for loitering or worse. The loneliness between what united all classes, however, was the loneliness. A noble girl pacing the conservatory in silks, a shop girl pressing roses into her hymn book, a coal delivery boy scrubbing his hands before asking a question he'd rehearsed 100 times, a clerk saving up for a cheap brooch, terrified she might laugh. They all lived with the same questions. Will they say yes? Will they write back? Will I be enough? They were not encouraged to speak of feelings. They were told that love was childish, that duty mattered more, that affection would come perhaps with time and silence. But many, lying in narrow beds, under slanted ceilings, or behind velvet drapes, stared at the dark and wondered, what if I never get to love at all? Conclusion: unequal hearts in Victorian England. Love was not blind. It was deeply aware of station, status, and suitability. A broken heart was a luxury some could not afford, and a scandal that others could not survive. The girl with the lace parasol and the girl with soot on her sleeves were not so different in their hopes, but the world told them they were, and so they stayed on opposite sides of the garden gate, watching, waiting, wishing, and thus another day passed in quiet, yearning. The Victorians wore their grief like a uniform. When death came to a household, whether it slipped in silently during the night, or struck suddenly with violence or fever, did not merely take someone away. It also reshaped the lives of those left behind. In particular, it reshaped love, because in Victorian England, love had to wait for morning, and morning could last a lifetime. The weight of black fabric, the morning dress was not just a color. It was a language. When someone died, especially a close family member, those left behind were expected to observe formal mourning. For women, this meant donning black from head to toe, bombazine crepe, jet beads, black gloves, a black veil, so thick it sometimes caused fainting in church. This mourning attire wasn't worn for a week, or even a few months. Widows were expected to wear full mourning for 2 full years, sometimes longer. Even unmarried daughters mourning a sibling or parent could be trapped in black for a year or more. During that time, one was expected to withdraw from society. No dancing, no visiting, no playing piano at evening gatherings, no laughter, no bright ribbons, no walking in public with a gentleman even if he was just a friend. Love, in all its forms, was placed into storage. A woman in mourning could not be courted. No matter how dearly someone loved her, a man might write her letters, but she could not write back, not without risking censure from her family or whispers from the neighborhood. Any sign of romantic attention was considered disrespectful. To the dead, it was as though time itself had stopped. Only the grief was allowed to live. A courtship interrupted by death in the autumn of 1874. A young woman named Claravoni, 22, had been receiving the regular attention of a postmaster's son named Edward. They had exchanged books. He had walked her home from chapel. It was understood quietly, respectfully, that they would marry come spring. But then Clara's older brother died in an industrial accident. The mourning began immediately. The mirrors in the house were covered in black crepe. The clocks were stopped. Visitors lowered their voices. Edward came to the house once. bringing flowers, but Clara could not receive him. Her mother wept in the next room. Her father stared at the hearth for hours. The weeks stretched into months. When Edward wrote, Clara read the letters in silence, then locked them away without replying. By the time a year had passed, his letters had grown shorter. After 2 years, they had stopped altogether when Clara finally emerged in lavender half-mourning. The first step back into life Edward was gone, married to another, a woman whose brother had not died, and Clara, still young, still quiet, folded his last letter and tied it with a black ribbon, placing it in the drawer beneath her gloves. Widowhood and waiting for widows, the rules were even stricter. A widow was expected to wear full mourning for at least 2 years, but often longer if her husband had been of high status. In those early months, she could not attend social events. Her only outings were to church, and only if she sat at the back. Even after moving from full mourning to half mourning, grey or lavender, instead of deep black remarriage, was considered unseemly if it occurred too soon. A widow who smiled too brightly or was seen walking with a gentleman too soon after her husband's death risked being labelled heartless or even immoral. One such case appeared in the pages of the Ladies' Gazette, where a widow was scolded publicly by a neighbour for purchasing lace only 8 months after her husband's death. The lace was white. The scandal was swift. It did not matter that she had 3 children to feed. It did not matter that her husband had left debts. She was to wear sorrow like armour. The unspoken lovers, not every mourning story involved widows. Sometimes it was the parents who died, or siblings, or a guardian whose wishes the living felt compelled to honour. In many cases, a budding romance between 2 young people was simply paused. A gentleman might begin calling upon a lady only for her father to die suddenly of apoplexy. Out of respect, he would stop his visits. She would retreat behind her drapes. Weeks might pass, then months, then months. Then, as society moved on, so would he, often reluctantly, sometimes bitterly. But duty came first, even duty to the dead. One young man, whose letters have survived in the archives of the Derbyshire Historical Society, wrote the following in 1852. I see her from afar at the market, still in mourning. I cannot speak to her. It has been 9 months. I fear she does not remember me, or worse that she does, and has chosen silence over suffering. Mourning was a family matter in Victorian households. Mourning was not just a personal choice, was often enforced by family hierarchy. A girl might be instructed by her mother to end correspondence with a suitor after the death of a cousin she barely knew. A boy might be warned by his father not to visit the home of a grieving family for fear of appearing opportunistic. Respect for mourning was also a marker of class. The middle and upper classes took pride in observing it properly, in changing the mourning attire at prescribed intervals, in avoiding entertainment, in ensuring the dead were honored through silence and sacrifice. The working poor, though they grieved no less deeply, often could not afford extended mourning. They had to go to work the next day. They might only have one dress and no black ribbon to spare, but even then they might still pin a scrap of dark cloth to their sleeve, not because etiquette required it, but because their heart did. Love letters in mourning envelopes. Some of the most tragic love stories of the period are told through stationery. During mourning, any letter sent by a grieving person was edged in black thick border that signaled sorrow before the letter was even opened. These black bordered envelopes were often preserved for decades. Some contained only a single line, "I cannot see you." Others held pages of restrained emotion, always avoiding words like love or longing, replacing them with respect and regret. And yet, in the quiet spaces between the lines, love lived. One woman wrote to her suitor, "I must remain in mourning until the leaves fall again. I dare not write more, but I walk where we used to walk, and I remember your kindness with gratitude that does not fade." A widow's second love, denied in one particularly poignant case recorded in a rural diary from 1886. A widow named Agnes fell in love with her late husband's younger brother, Thomas. They had known each other for years. After her husband's passing from consumption, Thomas began to visit more often, bringing wood, helping with accounts, watching over the children. Their affection grew slowly, carefully, quietly, but Agnes feared the judgment of her in-laws. So even when Thomas offered marriage, she refused. Not because she didn't love him, but because she believed it was her duty to remain faithful to the memory of the man she had buried. Thomas left for Canada. The following spring, Agnes never remarried. The weight of appearances perhaps the saddest. Truth of all was this: many Victorian lovers were not kept apart by war or scandal, but by appearances. It was not that they could not love, it was that they could not be seen to love. A woman dancing 6 months after a brother's death was whispered about. A man smiling at a widow was accused of indecency. An engagement formed during a mourning period was often broken for fear of gossip, and so people waited and waited until time wore the love down to something more like memory. Conclusion: love in the shadows. In a time when grief wore fabric and silence was called respect, love often slipped through the cracks. It waited behind curtains. It walked behind funeral processions. It folded itself into letters that could never be answered. In mourning, many Victorians did not just lose a person. They lost their future with someone else. A courtship paused became a courtship forgotten. A wedding postponed became a wedding that never was. And still they endured, with quiet dignity, with patience, with hearts that learned to beat beneath black veils and heavy expectations. For love in the Victorian age was not just about finding the right person, it was also about finding the right time and hoping that time wouldn't run out. In Victorian England, love between men and love between women existed not in the parlors or drawing rooms, but in the margins, quiet, coded, unspoken. It flourished not in open sunlight, but in the shaded corners of libraries, behind the closed doors of shared flats, and between the delicate lines of poetry. This was a time when same-sex attraction was not only forbidden by lit, was denied as even possible by much of polite society. Love between men, scandalous and criminal. Love between women, ignored, dismissed, or at best described as intense friendship. No parlor games, no matchmaking mothers, no teacup clues whispered across a drawing room, and yet people still fell in love. The language of silence and symbols without the vocabulary to name their feelings, or the permission to voice them. Queer Victorians became fluent in a different kind of language, one of hints, glances, coded phrases, and deliberate choices of flower, fabric, or phrase. For men, green carnations became a whispered symbol, famously popularized by Oscar Wilde. They meant something, but only to those who needed to understand. Letters were often written with dual meanings, and public friendships masked deeper affections. Women shared romantic friendships, often living together in what would come to be called Boston marriages, intimate partnerships between women. that outsiders rarely questioned, though the bond ran much deeper than convenience. A hand held a second too long, a poem too intimate. A shared bedroom in a London flat hit was all hidden in plain sight, where they met in a world where respectable courtship required chaperones, and matchmaking was always heteronormative. Those who strayed from that path created their own spaces. For men, this often meant meeting in public parks or certain clubs after dark places like Hyde Park's cruising grounds, or dim alleyways that offered moments of connection amid constant fear. Arrests were common. Disgrace was immediate. For women, the danger was different. The law didn't criminalize lesbianism, didn't even acknowledge it, but this invisibility came with its own cost. There was no framework, no community. Women in love were not illegal, but they were alone, so many turned to literature. Diaries, poems, and shared novels became tools of survival. In the writings of Emily Dickinson, Christina Rossetti, or Anne Lister, whose coded journals laid bare her love for women, we see a quiet defiance that history nearly forgot. The Cost of Love After 1885. The infamous Labouche Amendment criminalized gross indecency between men, an intentionally vague law that made even private affection illegal. This was the law that would later destroy Oscar Wilde's career, leading to public trials, prison time, and ruin. Love became a risk not of heartbreak, but of prison, exile, or suicide. Families disowned sons. Newspapers printed names. Lives were ended not by disease or age, but by shame and public cruelty. Women were spared the legal dangers, but not the social ones. A woman who strayed too far from conventional femininity, who refused marriage, who dressed too plainly, who loved too fiercely could be institutionalized, dismissed, or quietly forgotten. Courtship in the shadows. So imagine a woman slipping a love note into a friend's glove drawer, unsure if it will be read with confusion or secret joy. Imagine a man passing a folded handkerchief with a pressed violet tucked inside, meaning, I love you and I see you. These were the courtships that no one taught and everyone feared. There were no proposal scripts, no etiquette books, no engraved cards announcing an engagement. Just courage and the hope that the other person might feel the same. And yet, despite the weight of silence, some did find happiness. Some carved out lives together, under the radar, in seaside towns or quiet flats. They made families of choice. They lived in double rooms and signed leases together and grew old side by side without ever being asked what they were to one another. They just were. Let sleep find you in the silence of that time. As you close your eyes now, imagine them, those quiet figures moving through moonlit streets, their hands just barely brushing. Picture two women reading together by firelight, knees touching beneath the quilt. Two men exchanging a soft smile across the conservatory. They may not have had words, but they had love. And even in a world that refused to name them, they found ways to speak. Sometimes all love needs is a whisper. There was a time in Victorian England when love came not with flowers or serenades, but with a thump on the doorstep. The postman, in his blue coat and brass buttons, became an unlikely Cupid delivering sighs, secrets, and the slow unfolding of affections sealed in wax and scented with lavender. With the arrival of the penny post in 1840, the price of sending a letter dropped to just a single penny. And with that penny, a revolution began, not in the streets, but in the quiet, creaking drawers of writing desks across Britain. Lovers, once separated by miles, by propriety, or by meddling mothers, could now whisper to each other with ink and parchment, a romance in Ingtha, Victorian. Postal system was marvelously efficient. Most towns received mail multiple times per day. It was entirely possible to send a letter in the morning and receive a reply by evening. For lovers under watchful eyes, this changed everything. You could live in the same town and still conduct a relationship entirely by post. No chaperones. No family interruptions. Just the sacred privacy of a sealed envelope and the delicious possibility of discovery. Imagine a young woman slipping a note into the out tray before breakfast, her pulse racing as she passed the parlor where her mother embroidered, or a young clerk writing by gaslight, careful not to smudge the page as he tried to sound confident, clever, and madly in love. When the postman meant everything in many small villages. The postman knew everyone's businesses, especially the postmistresses, who often ran the local mail counters. These women became accidental keepers of countless romances. They knew whose hands trembled as they posted letters. They recognized handwriting. They noticed when someone suddenly received daily correspondence from Brighton or Bath. Some were silent allies. Some gossiped gently. A few interfered, slipping letters to mothers instead of sweethearts. And some, bless them, turned a blind eye as envelopes slipped between fingers too eagerly. There are countless real-life accounts of Victorian lovers, exchanging hundreds of letters over years, many never meeting in person until after a formal proposal had already been made. It was courtship by correspondence, devotion measured by postage, the language of love letters, Victorian love. Letters were often carefully phrased and restrained, but emotionally rich. The etiquette books warned against excessive sentimentality, but no rule book could stop a heart from spilling onto the page. A typical letter might begin, "My dearest Miss Langley, I hope this note finds you in health and peace, as I have. Thought of nothing else but your gentle smile since we last parted." Or, "Mr. Elwood, forgive my forwardness in writing again so soon. But your words lingered with me, and I find myself unable to sleep for want of reply." Letters were often numbered, so none would be read out of order. Lovers developed their own codes, underlining certain words, folding paper a certain way, or including pressed flowers that meant specific things. A violet for modesty, a pansy for I think of you. Many letters were intercepted by parents or servants. Some were burned unread. Others were hidden in drawers for decades and found only after death. Romance. Unfolded, imagine the joy of tearing open a letter to find a lock of hair enclosed, or a sketch of a shared memory to birds drawn in the margins, holding a ribbon in their beaks. Imagine reading and rereading the same lines every night by candlelight, the paper soft from folding. Some lovers exchanged letters for years before ever hearing the other's voice. Others used them as their only means of seeing one another's true thoughts, far from the pressure of propriety and parental eyes. And when a proposal came by post, it was often no less heartfelt than one delivered on bended knee. "My most precious Anne, if you would do me the infinite honor of becoming my wife, you need only send your reply enclosed with the small key I left in my last. I shall wait by the door each day until it arrives." The longest distances felt shorter. Soldiers wrote home from far-flung colonies. Governesses wrote to sweethearts they'd had to leave behind. Widows and widowers rekindled love across decades. The distance mattered less than the devotion. In a world where affection was often policed, and private conversations difficult to come by, The mail system became a loopholer private bridge between two minds. Even the stamps had rules. To place one upside down in the corner was to say, "I love you." To place it sideways meant "I miss you." There was a whole secret language of stamps known only to lovers. Sleep now, with postmarks in mind. So as you rest, picture a woman slipping a letter into a brass mailbox, heart pounding. Picture a man in uniform, receiving that same envelope 2 days later in a muddy field, and smiling like the sun just rose inside him. Let your breath slow, like the gentle pace of a pen moving across linen paper. Let your mind drift through the soft rustle of folded pages, the scent of ink, the weight of a sealed envelope pressed to the lips before posting. Because in Victorian England, love didn't always arrive in person. Sometimes it came with a postmark, and that was enough. Long before dating apps or even rotary phones, love-seeking Victorians turned to a surprising tool in their search for companionship. The newspaper, folded between advertisements for boot polish and reports on fog in the Thames, were curious little columns filled with longing, wit, and desperation. These were the earliest lonely hearts, ads where one might look for a governess, a husband, or a secret tryst with a gentleman of means, seeking a lady of lively temperament and good teeth. Courtship in Victorian England was stifled by rules, reputations, and relentless surveillance. So some people, shy, scandalous, or simply fed up, took their chances in ink. A quiet revolution happened not in parlors, but on printed pages passed across breakfast tables. A strange new courtship. The first personal ads began appearing in the late 17th century, but by the Victorian era, they became a strange, secretive staple in papers across Britain. While upper-class marriages were arranged and working-class romances born of proximity, the newspaper offered an escape hatch, a place to be bold, clever, or simply hopeful. For the price of a few pence, you could insert a few lines describing your ideal marchand, perhaps yourself, a young lady of genteel habits and good moral character, seeks acquaintance with a man of letters or law, must not smoke or gamble, widow not objectionable. Some readers laughed, some sneered, others ... replied, coded longing and witty lies, because open courtship was so restricted. Many ads were filled with coded phrases and double meanings. A gentleman of leisure might mean someone of means, someone without a job. A modest and retiring woman might, in truth, be absolutely exhausted by judgmental ants. Men described themselves as of pleasing appearance or steady in character, if not in income. Women were more constrained, always needing to mention moral virtue and a lack of scandal. There was an obsession with teeth, complexion, ankles, and handwriting. Then there were the humorous or unhinged entries. Gentleman, 42, seeks lady, who enjoys chess, long walks, and silence, must dislike dogs and laughter, no Catholics. Or, mathematician, recently dismissed, seeks lady of any age or profession to discuss astronomy or escape to the colonies. Bring umbrella, scams, scandals, and satire, of course. Where there's romance, there's risk. Newspapers, sometimes, carried warning columns alerting readers to impostors, bigamists, or swindlers who used lonely hearts ads to lure victims. Some desperate women were promised marriage, only to be left penniless after handing over their savings to a banker in disguise. In one notorious 1860s case, a man placed ads across multiple newspapers, proposing to women all over England, collecting dowries before vanishing. He was eventually caught, but not before at least a dozen women lost both money and pride. Meanwhile, satirical magazines like Punch lampooned the whole phenomenon with cartoons and mock ads, portraying ad writers as hopeless romantics or scheming gold diggers. Still, the real ads kept coming, because beneath the humor and absurdity, the need was real. Hope between the lines, despite the stigma. Some lonely hearts ads led to genuine connection. There are documented cases of long marriages that began with printed lines in the Times or the Morning Advertiser. Some couples met secretly, some corresponded for months before meeting, and some dared to fall in love despite the raised eyebrows of society. In many ways, these early ads were far ahead of their time. Private, direct, and oddly empowering. Women could seek love without family interference. Men who were shy or socially awkward could express themselves with confidence, even queer. Victorians, those whose love could never be openly expressed, sometimes found subtle ways to seek companionship, using carefully veiled language that only the right reader would understand. A few real examples. Let's pause to enjoy a few actual Victorian personal ads from archived papers. Some will make you smile, others may make your heart ache just a little. Bachelor, aged 35, fond of flowers and theology, seeks lady to share a small cottage and a large garden. Lady, aged 29, would like to meet gentleman who can accept a spirited mind in a modest frame. Must have all his hair. Young man of 24 seeks lady to converse with. Not overly concerned with appearances, though must not eat loudly. Widow, lonely, still cheerful, will respond to all letters, save those mentioning ferrets. These glimpses into the past are not so different from the profiles we scroll today. They are stories of people wanting not just love, but companionship, someone to listen, someone to write to, someone to miss. Let sleep come like a folded newspaper so. As you drift toward rest, picture a woman unfolding the paper over her. T-eyes scanning until they stop on a few careful lines, her heartbeat quickening. Picture a man seated by candlelight, writing his reply with a stub of pencil and too much hope. A world of longing passed silently between pages and post offices, between aliases and aching hearts. There were no photos, no swipes, no guarantees, only words, and sometimes that was enough. Before the rise of casual dates and coffee shop encounters, romance in all its awkward, structured Victorian glory was staged beneath chandeliers. The ball was a courtship arena, complete with polished shoes, breathless orchestras, and the watchful gaze of nearly everyone in the room. But despite the glow of gaslight and the lilt of violins, a Victorian ball was less a dreamy affair and more a performance under scrutiny. It was called dancing, but it was more like treading water in a social shark tank. Each twirl came with the risk of real consequences. This was not just about rhythm, it was about rank, reputation, and the ruthless rules of who could dance, with whom, and when. An evening dressed in expectations. The moment you stepped into a ballroom, you entered a machine. The air was scented with perfume and burning candles. The floors waxed to glass-like slickness, and the musicians, often tucked behind ferns or in upper balconies, played not from inspiration, but from schedule. Ladies wore gowns that revealed their shoulders, but not their freedoms. Gentlemen wore coats with tails sharp enough to slice gossip in half. The very scent of the ballroom was choreographed. Rosewater and powder, ambition and nerves. There was a reason young men carried dance cards, small, decorative booklets, in which they recorded which lady they would dance with, and during which number. A lady's card filled up quickly and who signed it said everything. A full card from the right. Men could raise her prospects overnight. A card half empty, cause for whispers. The rules of engagement on the dance floor Victorian dancers weren't just about movement. They were courtship in miniature each waltz, or quadrille, a tiny time-boxed audition for marriage. And the rules were suffocatingly specific. No young lady danced more than 2 dancers with the same man in S. Engagement rumors were desired. Unmarried couples were chaperoned at all times. No disappearing into the refreshment room together. Considered scandalously, close was only permitted for respectable couples after being vetted by hosts. Touching was tightly choreographed, a gloved hand, the lightest clasp. Nothing more, no crossing class lines. A gentleman might flirt with a maid, but to dance with her in public, unthinkable. If you stumbled in a quadrille, you didn't just trip, you might have just tripped your way out of a season's worth of chances. If your dress tore, if you sweat too obviously, if you chose the wrong partner, the damage could be permanent. Dancing under supervision, every movement, every spin, smile, or whispered word took place beneath the surveillance of parents, relatives, matchmakers, and rival debutantes. Even the music itself felt like it was watching you. Chaperones perched like gargoyles on velvet chairs along the edge of the room, fans fluttering in judgment. Mothers tracked eligible sons with hawk eyes, watching which girls they danced with, and how long they lingered near the punch bowl. You could be dancing to the strains of Strauss, but feel like you were waltzing across a minefield. Moments of rebellion, yet, within this gilded cage, some found tiny freedoms. A whispered compliment, disguised as a remark about the music. A slightly too long gaze as partners bowed at the end of a dance. A secret note slipped beneath a folded dance card. For some, the dance floor was the only place they could speak, if only in coded steps. A gentleman might subtly squeeze a lady's hand during a turn. A girl might feign fatigue to escape to the balcony, where a few precious words could be exchanged in secret. Still, the consequences loomed. One badly timed flirtation could brand a girl as forward. One careless joke from a gentleman could be remembered for years. Even laughter was judged too loud, too soon, too often. And then the candles flickered low by midnight. Shoes pinched, dresses wilted, and nerves frayed. Couples had danced themselves into blisters or disappointment. The last waltz was often the most sought after, the one a suitor might request if he was truly interested to be chosen for it. Was a quiet thrill to be passed over. Was a private sorrow. Then came the cloaks, the carriages, and the tired silence on the way home. The candles went out. The music ceased. But the dance wasn't over. Gossip would follow in the morning. Sleep comes like a slow waltz now. As the orchestra plays its final tune in your imagination, let your mind picture the swaying figures. On polished wood, the flicker of chandeliers overhead, and the nervous hopes folded into every careful step. The rules were heavy. The gazes were constant. But sometimes, despite it all, a glance turned into something more, and so the young girl in blue and the boy with the too tight cravat turn once more through memory, then fade into quiet sleep now, where the music still plays but only for you. Before love could bloom or even be considered, there was a number, a quiet number, whispered by mothers, discussed over tea, written in ledgers alongside inheritances and land. And that number was a dowry. In Victorian England, romance began, not with butterflies or poems, but with balance sheets and birth certificates. And at the center of it all was the debutante, a young girl dressed in white, paraded into society like a porcelain doll painted, poised, and priced. Her season wasn't about her heart. It was about her value. What was a dowry? A dowry was more than money. It was a promise, a transaction, and a preemptive solution to future marital disputes. It might come in the form of cash, land, shares in a company, or a well-appointed cottage. The bigger the dowry, the better the match. For a girl, her dowry could mean the difference between marrying into a grand estate or not marrying at all. For families without wealth, it was a heavy burden, often saved for over years or borrowed. And, for a man of title but no fortune, he might marry a woman he barely knew, simply because her dowry could rescue his collapsing estate. The debutante season begins, 17 or 18. Girls were brought out to society in a grand debut, a ritual both glamorous and terrifying. They were often dressed in white to symbolize purity, wearing real feathers in their hair, and presented formally to the queen or a senior royal figure in court. This was not merely a tradition, it was an auction disguised as a ball. Her success wasn't measured in waltzes or compliments, but in how many suitable men called on her afterward. Her future depended on curtsying at the right depth, making the right impression, and showing just enough charm to catch an eye without seeming bold. The season ran from spring through early summer and was packed with formal balls, garden parties, and endless tea visits. It was exhausting. It was strategic, and it was nearly all pretend. What suitors looked for in theory, suitors were seeking character. In reality, they wanted a suitable dowry, good breeding, a well-known family name, or bloodline fertility, youth, health, physical beauty, and above all, obedience, or at least the appearance of it. Charm helped. Piano playing was encouraged. French was a bonus, but none of it mattered without money. Even the most angelic girl with the brightest laugh could be passed over if her family's purse was light. Behind the smile, imagine the pressure of those young girls, told they must charm but not flirt, speak but never too loudly, look beautiful but never vain, dance gracefully but never demand attention. They practiced their curtsies for months too deep, and you might fall. Too shallow, and you seemed rude. They wore corsets so tight that fainting was expected, even built into the ritual. Salted-smelling bottles were passed around like perfume. All the while, their futures were being silently negotiated in drawing rooms they weren't allowed to enter. Those left behind, not every girl was chosen. For some, the season ended in silence. No marriage proposals, no calling cards, just returned gowns and quiet disappointment. They were said to be left on the shelf. The label stuck to them like dust on silk. It meant fewer invitations, less social relevance, and, for many, a life of permanent dependence on fathers, brothers, or charity. Some found strength in spinsterhood. Others lived in loneliness they could never admit aloud. Let the candles flicker lone now. Let your eyes close and picture the ballroom againly this time. See the debutantes standing still while music swirls around them. A room full of nervous girls in white clutching fans, praying that someone might notice them for more than their father's accounts. A nervous girl curtsies, her knees trembling. Another bites the inside of her cheek to stay awake in a dress that weighs more than her future feels worth. One forces a laugh, one forces a smile, and just one lets her eyes drift to the open window and imagines being anywhere else, sleep. Now, where the season never ends and expectations melt into dreams. Love, they said, was patient. But in Victorian England, it also had to be practical, measured, and financially scheduled. A proposal did not lead to a swift wedding. In many cases, it led instead to years, sometimes decades of waiting. For a salary, for a house, for a death in the family that might free up inheritance. And so, countless couples entered into what was politely called a long engagement, but what often became a slow erosion of joy. Tethered tightly to economic reality, we must wait until he has means. A man was not expected to marry until he could support a household, which meant earning enough not just for himself, but for his wife, future children, and at least one servant. This applied even more fiercely to middle-class professionals, clergymen, solicitors, schoolmasters, whose respectability hinged on appearing both comfortable and conservative. A man in love might have to wait 5, 10, even 15 years before marrying the woman he'd proposed to as a young man. In that time, her youth slipped away, and his letters became less poetic, more apologetic. The paper trail of waiting here is a fictionalized diary entry, stitched from the many real ones left behind by Victorian women who waited. April 3rd, 1867, another spring without him. He writes still, always kindly, but now he signs simply yours and not yours, heart and soul. I don't blame him. His salary is not yet enough, and the curate's house is still occupied by the old rector who refuses to die. I am 27 now. Mama says not to speak of it. The roses bloom, I do not. Or a letter, dearest Eliza, I have petitioned again for the post in Exeter, but it has gone to a man with 3 children. I do not know how long this will take. You are in my thoughts hourly. I dream of your hand in mine, in our own small parlor, with the dog you once said we should have. Wait for me. Yours always, Thomas. These were not rare. They were commonplace. The dream of a little house of our own, a house, was not merely shelter. It was the symbol of readiness. No respectable man could marry and move in with his in-laws. No woman could enter her husband's family home without whispers. And so the couple dreamed, year after year, of the modest home that would one day be theirs. 2 rooms, a kitchen, a window box, somewhere to hang her needlework, somewhere he might read the newspaper aloud on Sundays. But rent was high, inheritance slow, careers moved with a snail's grace. Some women waited for men who never arrived. Others accepted alternate proposals after growing tired of waiting. Growing older while promised there were joke scrawl, ones about women who waited so long they missed their chance entirely. A fiancé past 30 became suspect. Was she desperate? Why hadn't he married her? Was something wrong? But underneath the snide remarks was quiet sorrow. Women spent their best years embroidering linen they might never use. They saved up for hope chests. They turned away other offers out of loyalty. And they watched their younger sisters marry, while they sat by the window, reading old letters like prayers. The stories they didn't tell, one woman waited 11 years for her fiancé to secure a curate's income. By the time he did, her eyesight had begun to fade from embroidery work. They married in a chapel with only 2 witnesses, because her father no longer approved of the match. Another couple, both school teachers, waited 9 years. When they finally wed, they had just enough for a 2-room flat and a coal stove. Their only wedding gift was a pair of candlesticks. There are hundreds of such stories, many never written, because they were never considered romantic enough, but they were real, and they mattered. Let the waiting fade, and now, let the letters rest. Let the ink dry. Picture the woman who tucked each envelope into a ribbon-tied box. Picture the man who walked home past wedding shops, calculating costs in his head, not daring to look too long at the veils. Close your eyes and imagine the small house at the edge of town, empty still, but waiting. A hearth without a fire, a bed without a quilt, a door unopened. Sleep now where love is not postponed, where no one is left waiting in vain. She wore white because she had to. The veil was heavy, the corset tighter than usual. The lace gloves itched. The bouquet was real, but her smile often was not. The Victorian wedding was not the romantic culmination of passion and longing that we imagine today. It was a performance, a staged ritual with strict scripts and stiff poses, orchestrated for family, class, and propriety. And for many women, the wedding day was not the happiest day of their life. It was the most exhausting, scripted from the start. Victorian weddings followed a rigid patternist, especially among the middle and upper classes. First came the planning, which fell largely on the bride's mother and aunts, who would be invited, who must be seen attending, what carriages, flowers, gloves, fans, bonnets, lace, and silver were required. Nothing could be improvised. It had to appear tasteful, respectable, and correct. Even the time of the ceremony was fixed. Most weddings occurred in the morning, followed by a breakfast knot. A party, dancing was rare. Speeches were short. Applause was discouraged. And love, that wasn't discussed aloud. Stiff photos and stiffer faces photography was still relatively new in the mid-Victorian period, and wedding portraits were not the playful, candid moments we know today. Photos required subjects to stand absolutely still for several minutes, often unsmiling due to the exposure time. This created the infamous eerie portraits, brides with serious expressions, standing bolt upright, veils cascading like tombstone cloth, grooms beside them like statues. No joyful embraces, no laughing bridesmaids, just stillness and silence, and a subtle weight behind the eyes. It wasn't because they weren't happy, it was because they had to look dignified. Behind the veil, the Victorian bride's veil was thick, long, and symbolic. It represented purity and submission, and it was meant to conceal her face until the moment she was legally his dot. But behind the veil, beneath the layers of lace and tulle, many emotions flickered. For some women, there was relief after long engagements or difficult courtships. For others, there was uncertainty. Did she really know this man? Was this truly her choice or her family's? Could she speak her doubts, if she had any? And for some, there was a quiet sort of mourning for girlhood, for independence, for the life they were leaving behind. The guest list and the gossip weddings were as much about social signaling as they were about vows. The invitations were worded with painful precision. The guest list revealed alliances. A poorly planned wedding could ruin reputations. Seating was an art form. Servants watched closely. Who gifted what was noted? Whispers passed between fans. A young couple might find themselves caught in a web of obligation and spectacly watching their own wedding unfold as if they were guests at someone else's event. The breakfast after the wedding breakfast was not a feast. It was usually a mid-morning gathering with light food, polite toasts, and a great deal of watching what you said and how you said it. There was no first dance, no dramatic cake cutting, no grand romantic moment, just the slow, proper movement of people through a house or hired hall, sipping tea and discussing the weather. And then the couple would slip away to a rented carriage, a small inn, or a Long train ride to Brighton or Bath, relief, resignation, or something else, and then it was over. The corset unlaced, the veil removed, the gloves peeled away, and in the small rented room, a bride sat at the edge of a strange bed and looked at the man she had just promised forever to. Sometimes there was a feeling of peace, other times there was only tiredness. For him, the day was over. For her, it had only just begun. Let the candles go out now, let the bustle settle, let the flower petals fade. Picture the bride, not in the ceremony, but afterward alone for a moment, removing the pins from her hair, her hands trembling slightly. Outside, the carriages roll away. The house is quieter now. The dress is hung, the veil draped over a chair. She does not speak. She does not need to. Close your eyes and rest, where weddings don't weigh so heavily, and no love must begin beneath 100 eyes. Sleep now. Time passes, as it always does. The lace yellows, the gloves crumble, and the letters, those carefully folded pieces of longing, fade into brittle. Forgotten scraps tucked in boxes no one opens anymore. And yet, love lingers. Not just the grand, cinematic love that ends with a kiss beneath a clock tower, but the smaller kind. The kind that survives etiquette books, that slips past chaperones, that outlives corsets and courtships and cold tea. Let us sit together in this final chapter and look back, gently, not to mock or mourn, but to understand what they called love and how it echoes into what we call love now. Then and now, a mirror. Warped Victorian courtship was many things: ceremonial, exhausting, repressed, and silent. But it was also, in its own way, sincere. They believed love had to be earned, restrained, and watched carefully. It was something to be cultivated over time, not sparked in a moment. There were rules, thousands of them, and to love someone was to tiptoe through an etiquette minefield, hoping to emerge on the other side with your reputation intact and your heart. Somehow, still hold up today, our world is freer, noisier, quicker. We swipe, we match, we ghost. We date in pixels and break up in text, and yet we still long. The methods have changed. The hunger has not. Love without laced modern romance rarely comes wrapped in satin ribbons or sealed with wax, but it is still built of signals. A second glance, a longer reply, a playlist shared at 2 a.m. even now. We search for the sign that someone cares, whether it's in a fan's flutter or a scene checkmark. Perhaps love is not something that ever fully evolves. Perhaps it is always part confusion, part courage, always a little quiet and a little desperate. The Victorians might not understand our dating apps. We might not understand their morning brooches, but both are acts of yearning. The slow kind still exists despite our fast pace. Many still crave the slow kind of love, the kind with waiting and wondering, the kind that grows in letters and silences. Some still write to each other, some still wait. The human soul, it seems, hasn't changed as much as the technology that holds it. We still fall in love badly. We still say the wrong things. We still hold our breath before pressing send. And we still so often love more deeply than we know how to express what was lost. What was gained the Victorians lost much to silence. They lost years, to propriety, to fear, to custom. Queer love was erased. Women's voices were quieted. Passion was stifled by rules. In many ways, they suffered for it, but they gained something truer, reverence for the fragile unfolding of intimacy, a belief that love was sacred, not casual. that it mattered how you asked someone to dance. That waiting could be an act of love itself. We, in turn, have gained voices, freedom, choice, but we have also lost some of the slowness, the pause, the meaning that came from having to earn each word. Both times held beauty, and both times held heartbreak. The dream doesn't change so now, as you prepare for sleep. Let your thoughts drift gently between then and now. A woman in 1875, staring at a sealed letter, heart pounding. A man in 2025, rereading a message and debating a reply. A girl in a silk gown, wondering if he'll visit on Sunday. A boy in a hoodie, refreshing a profile, hoping to match. Two souls, decades apart, hoping to be seen, to be chosen, to be loved. History has changed. Love hasn't. Let that comfort you as the candlelight dims in your mind. You are not alone in your longing. They, too, lay awake beneath lace pillows and starched sheets, wondering if someone, somewhere, was thinking of them. And maybe someone was. Sleep now,